Welcome, Robin.
Hey, Naveen, how you doing?
I'm very well, mate. How are you?
Yeah, good, thank you. Good. What a lovely day it is.
I know. I so wish I was outside right now, social distancing from everyone else with a beer in my hand. That would be really good.
Oh, for a beer garden right now.
There was actually a great there was a great TikTok where neighbors had put their taken their fence and made it into a dining table, and were actually having a social distancing.
I got a WhatsApp message earlier in the week. There was someone had photoshopped garden centre on the front of a pub.
Excellent. Well, listen, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me this afternoon. I know, like the rest of us, you're all very busy, but it's always really
my pleasure.
About innovative things that people are doing, and new things that people are doing. But let's just start with Sydeer. Tell me a little bit about this great consultancy name, which I couldn't pronounce earlier on.
Yeah, so Sydeer, I suppose, is a slightly more founded to be a more optimistic cybersecurity consultancy. So there's an awful lot of fear, uncertainty, and doubt that's kind of out there in the information security market, and I don't think selling on fear is a particularly good way to go about it. Be that as a provider to a customer, or as as a security practitioner within your company to senior management or whatever it is. And there's a better way, a slightly more positive way to go about things. And so we help people to better quantify and communicate their cyber risk to the business, and better explain what's going on, either upfront as part of a risk assessment, risk analysis, or if the worst happened and you've had a big breach, then at the tail end, where you've got lots of senior management asking you questions and what's going on, basically helping teams to kind of bridge that communication gap between business and technical.
I mean that's great. I think the whole concept of positivity around our industry is something I'm actually quite passionate about, because I see the negativity surrounding our industry quite a lot, and that's actually quite reflective of what's happening in the world today. But also, that definitely within the digital space, there seems to be this consistent view of putting people or organizations down because of failure. Or perceived failure. So your focus being, I assume, within the SMB and the corporate space, right?
We work with organizations of various sizes, from pretty small, tens of employees, right the way up to kinds of tens of thousands of employees. So cover quite a wide spectrum. It's generally people that have something that they know they need to protect, and want to do something about it.
So do you know what kind of advice would you give an organization that large or small, that has suffered a potential catastrophic failure, that has in the midst of, if they're an existing client, if they're in the midst of a breach, what are the sort of 3 to 5 steps that you would be sort of guiding them towards, in order to effectively respond to what they're going through?
So I think the first thing is to stop and work out what you do know for sure and what you don't know. What are you assuming, and what do you know to be the truth? And the answer is there's probably an awful lot of ambiguity that you're trying to deal with, and your management team, your peers, colleagues around the business may be in varying degrees of comfort as to that level of ambiguity, right? So it's especially if it's a really big breach, a really high profile breach, it's going to be quite an emotional time for people. So actually having that pause and reset and go, right, what do we know? What's happened? What are we assuming? How do we verify whether that's true or not? If you take if you've got ransomware and skulls and crossbones popping up all over your screens, then you've probably got ransomware. But equally, it might just be an email out of the blue that says, "Hey, I've taken your customer database," and they've given you, I don't know, 5 records to prove that it's true. And how would you know if they've given you first name, last name, maybe the last 4 digits of a card number and an email address, and said, "We've got your whole customer database"? Would you know that that was your data or not? And how would you go about matching up whether that was, where would you even start from that to verify whether you've actually been breached or it's just someone trying a fast one on you? Hey Naveen, I've got all your data. Give me 100K and I'll be on my way. It's those sorts of things about what do you know and what do you need to find out, where you kind of need to get that kind of rhythm going.
So one of the things you mentioned there is about I suppose the emotions, right? So emotions are very high. Security teams under a significant amount of pressure. Executives under a significant amount of pressure.
Yeah.
How would you advise them to take a breath and pay less attention to what's being reported in the press and focus on a task at hand? Because that's sometimes very difficult. Because in our 24-hour news cycle, sometimes the narrative is so negative that it can be hard to motivate a security function and or an external party that's coming in to come and help you. So how would you guide your client through kind of that?
You ask a really good question, and it's a really good point, because often people focus so much on that specific task in hand, they forget about some of the softer side of things and the people side of things. So if the culture in your business is one that blames people for things, if someone thinks that it's their fault, they're going to be more focused on, "Oh, well, I've lost my job anyway, and maybe I should be looking for a new one." They're not going to be trying to resolve the issue. They're not going to be trying to get things back to normal and get going again. People may be worried about their jobs, and that may not be directly within the security team. That could be across the business. We hear horror stories of big breaches and millions and millions of customer records being lost and share prices tumbling and that kind of stuff. Especially with the kind of current economic climate, lots of people inside the security team and out may be distracted. So I think it's really important to that it's happened. You need to acknowledge it and move beyond that kind of bit and focus on the response and the remediation, and really use that as the thing to rally around and pull together, rather than it feeling too much like you're after exactly what happened and who was responsible and why did how could they ever have let it happen. I think that's quite important when you're in that moment, and having responded to quite a few high-profile breaches. The other thing is to make sure that you're getting enough sleep. They can be really, really long days, and so where I'm taking boards through tabletop exercises and that kind of stuff. One of the questions is, so how many of your staff, do you know how long it takes them to commute in and out every day? If your average commute is over an hour, and you're expecting people to be in before 8 and they're not leaving the office till 9 or 10 at night, and then they've got an hour either side or maybe an hour and a half either side, is it the sort of thing where you're going to look to try and put them up in accommodation that's nearby? Are you going to feed them? How are you going to those kind of basic human needs of sleep and food and water and that kind of stuff, and then how are you going to give them the opportunity to get that rest, recuperate themselves, and be effective? Because you can't be doing 18-hour days for day after day after day, week after week, and sometimes it can take weeks. Look at months. Look at the EasyJet breach, for example. That was months ago that happened, and they've obviously done some investigation, and now they're finally telling people. Now, I'm not saying that it would need to have been 18-hour days for them for 2 months to find out what's gone on, but you need to sustain your people, because they're the ones that are actually making the difference and getting you back on track.
I mean, with large scale, EasyJet's a good example, but with large scale breaches such as EasyJet, there's a time lapse in terms of the compromise itself, and that's an unknown factor. So that can generate a sense of worry. But in addition to that, the news cycle that surrounds it is also very interesting. As of yesterday, there was suggestion by the NCSC that there's a Chinese government involvement in that breach, right? And that was being investigated. So these tend to stem off to various things, and actually not very helpful for the security team that's trying to solve the problem in house, right?
No, and you'll probably have some hot takes as well from InfoSec Twitter, or people on social media saying how could they let it happen, or so and so is going to be for the chop, and these kind of things, and dumping on the security team, the leadership team in that kind of moment isn't really isn't cool in my mind. They've got a job to do. They are where they are, and time will tell. There may be genuine negligence that's allowed them to get into this situation, but we have to remind ourselves that actually our job as the good guys is to prevent cybercrime and people trying to the bad guys. It's us against them collectively as an industry. It's not about one team getting one over the other. I've had the fortune to work with some really kind of innovative security teams over the years, and where they're happy to share resources between companies and things like that. They've got each other's back, and I think we need more of that and less of people kind of just dumping on taking cheap shots.
Yeah, and I think you kind of hit the nail on the head about collaboration within the industry, collaboration through technical partners and that supply chain. I think what's not helpful also is that in times of breaches, you've got a lot of people trying to chance their arm, saying, hey, look at our service, look at our endpoint, look at our piece of tech, right? If they're busy dealing with a breach, they're not really going to be shopping. So the logic of doing all of that tends not to make sense. And actually, from your own experience, I mean, you mentioned this while you're at, I believe, while you're at BAE, you had an opportunity to have insight into some large scale breaches. Without naming names, of course, as a confidentiality. What would you say what was your takeaway from that experience, rather than sort of the reverse side, as a cybersecurity professional being knee deep in managing incidents and knee deep in providing advice? It is also probably quite hard not to get emotionally invested in what you're trying to do in supporting those individuals as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you use the word emotion. It's absolutely emotional. If you've got a big breach, and the people that you're dealing with are human, right? They will be feeling those emotions. They will be, if you're being extorted for money, it's a very emotional event for you, especially if you haven't ever considered it and thought about it beforehand. Getting an email out of the blue that's demanding hundreds of thousands or millions of pounds, otherwise they're going to release your customer database, and you've got no idea who's behind that email address. You don't know whether it's a bedroom hoodie hacker or nation state, right? Or that kind of organized crime group. It is a very emotional thing for people, especially if it's the first time they've really come into contact with it, and that goes for security practitioners and people in the business as well. If you're you might think that you're a really hardened kind of security pro. If you've not been in there and you've not had to deal with a really big breach, and CEO's got to go out in front of, going to be interviewed by the press or going to put a statement out later today, and they're asking for an update, and they're saying, who was it? When was it? What did they take? That kind of stuff. And you're going, I just don't know. I don't know the answer. I don't know, there are ways to manage all of that, and a good comms team will help in that. But yeah, it is a very emotional experience for a lot of people, practicing and rehearsing those sorts of things can help get you more familiar with that and be more comfortable with some of that ambiguity that we talked about earlier. Take better decisions in that moment. So you know, a lot of where I've helped in the past has been an articulation of that risk back to the business, especially if you've taken systems offline or you've shut things down. You know, maybe it's like TravelX earlier in the year. At some point, the chief exec is going to ask you as the CISO or the senior security person whether it's safe to turn those systems back online. And you're not going to have a good answer to that question because you're not going to categorically know one way or another, right? There is no way to know one way or another. And so breaking it down into kind of, well, this is the risk. You know, the impact won't have changed for us, right? We've still got the same amount of customer data. It's still worth the same amount of money to the bad guys. You know, we're probably going to be getting a lot more interest, both from, you know, black hat, but also security researchers who are now going to start having a probe around and see what have they done? Did they patch that vulnerability? You know, what version of SSL or TLS are they using? You know, so actually the amount of interest when you put something back live is going to peak. So inherently your risk is going to be higher when you do that as well. It will trail off again afterwards, but you know, being able to step people through and explain that to them in simpler business terms, you know, that's kind of where they need to get to.
So one of the things that I find quite challenging, and I don't know if this sits with you as well, but there generally, even in 2020, seems to be a bit of a disconnect between the way, in the event of a breach, and you have specialized comm teams, or you have a CEO that's in front of a camera. There still seems to be a slight disconnect in what they say versus what the reality of, you know, the situation is. So how can we, you know, as security professionals, start to, you were talking about a clear, concise messaging, distilled to language that they can understand. But even if it's provided, CEOs are CEOs, senior execs will, you know, say what they want. They tend not to stick to scripts. You know, there's primes examples of that, many of them, you know, that we can find online, that you could mock. But actually, it's not a mocking situation. It's actually quite detrimental to their reputation as a result, right? You know. So how would you start advising those senior execs to stop, look, and listen using a really simple traffic light system, right, before they go sit in front of a camera?
So you know, a lot of that will come down to the comms team, and you know, they need a good comms team around them, and to support that and to help work out what that message is. They also need to hopefully avoid some of those, you know, tropes like, you know, we take the security and protection of your data seriously and those kind of things. They always feel extremely jarring, right? Following an event. You know, we take the protection of your data and privacy of your data serious is great when the stable doors open and the horse is bolted. So there is an element of being human there and saying it as it is, and there's a spectrum, I suppose, because on one end, you know, using a recent example, you've got EasyJet, who didn't really say anything for months and now have come out and said something and kept their customers in the dark, in inverted commas. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got you know, the TalkTalk incident, and they came out and said, you know what, we don't know exactly what's happened, but it could be all of our customer data, and we just want our customers to be aware of that so they can take the right precautions. You know, they got kind of slated for doing that by security practitioners. But if it was your parent or grandparent, would you rather that they heard about it and were aware that someone might phone them up and try and scam them out of their life savings, or not? You know, it's there's a balance, you know, there to strike. But I think the kind of putting your customers first is always, it's got to be a good look, right?
And I suppose, you know, they've got the added pressure of, you know, legal focus on GDPR. Those customers were breaching.
There are going to be things that they can say, and there are going to be things that they absolutely can't say, and they're going to have lawyers in their ear as well as you as you know, you as a security team being asked for what's happened. The lawyers are going to be saying, don't say that, do say this, you know, don't admit any liability, You know, there's going to be a whole load of different conflicting messages that they're getting that need to be kind of modeled together. So one of the best things you can do as a security team is to be fairly calm and consistent in your message and how that updates, and as you get more information, what's changed and why, and feed that in. And just as you are a professional who understands your security realm, trust that if you're speaking to a comms person or a PR agency, that they are professionals in what they're doing, and the lawyers are professional in what they're doing, and you all have to come together and kind of coalesce around that message that you're going to put out.
So one of the really interesting thing I saw as a result of the EasyJet issue was the NCSC releasing a statement yesterday providing advice and guidance to anyone that potentially has been affected by this. But also their advice and guidance was also, they focused one of the lines focused on 2FA. EasyJet, an app, doesn't deploy 2FA either on its website and or on its app. So I again felt like the NCSC potentially was having a dig at an organization that maybe failed to implement controls. We understand as security professionals, two-factor authentication is now just a standard tool. You would expect to see when requiring authentication authorization into a service, right? But it's not generally widely used in the public domain, right?
You say that it's an interesting one, right? Because and the Verizon report this week's really interesting as well. So they're saying only 1 in 6 breaches actually involve malware. Phishing, credential stuffing, those kind of things. They're the key ways that organized crime, and it is predominantly organized crime. Over half the breaches that they reported this year were tracked back to organized crime, and 9 out of 10 were financially motivated. That's where the focus is now, and I do wonder sometimes whether there is it's about focus as an industry. It's also about the basics and kind of now wash your hands. Kind of, are you really focusing on getting 2FA rolled out across it? Was that your number one priority in the last 12 months? Or were you chasing, some AI, ML, blockchain, something or other detection tool that's gonna, where's your focus? Because, that's statistically, that's where the bad thing is, right? And it's basic hygiene stuff. It is the now wash your hands, right? And, the incentives sometimes I don't think stack up, right? So from a security professional point of view, you want to have on your CV that you've worked with the latest and greatest technology, that you've got these badges, that kind of stuff. No one is going out there saying, you know what, I got worked with IT, collaborated across the business, and we got everything patched this month. Absolutely everything, right? But I'd be willing to guess that both you and I, Naveen, if we saw that as like someone's achievement on their CV, forget rolling out latest and greatest DLP or EDR or this, that, the other, you'd be like, I want to interview that person. Right?
No, it's actually a great way to look at it, right?
And so there's those kind of incentives. Vendors want to push out the latest and greatest things. Security professionals want to be seen to be working with those and kind of be seen as being the latest and greatest. But actually a lot of the stuff that we're being hit by is old basic stuff, and it's not necessarily sexy. One of the directors that used to work with at BAE said had an idea around a campaign of trying to we should make cyber less sexy. Okay, well, not necessarily good for business, but I kind of get where you're going with it. It is those.
Actually, if we made it less sexy, we'd probably just shut down, right?
There's important stuff to do there, but you can. And I think for me, there's a basic level of stuff you've got to do, right? And some of that, for example, is if you've got web-facing stuff, 2FA, same with your RDP, if you're using RDP and those sorts of things, and then use risk and risk assessment to drive the rest, right? Because
touching on, sorry to interrupt, but
no, that's right.
Basic hygiene bit, because I think you've raised a really important point. How is it that still a lot of organizations get basic hygiene wrong?
So I think it's difficult, right? It's really difficult. We shouldn't underestimate that.
So that's really key, right? It's
But
people think it's easy. So an exec might think, based by the using the word basic, you're talking about simplistic methods. So again, simple to deny.
I'd kind of go for the kind of sports analogy, right? You know, if you're Roger Federer, or if you're you know, if you're Lewis Hamilton, or you know, you're someone who's really at the top of your game and gets it, you know, spot on every single time, that is because of the tens of thousands of times that you've practiced doing that beforehand. And you know, are you putting that effort into making it look effortless? Because you know, we all know that you know, it takes a lot of effort to make things look easy, right? And that's where I think a lot of it is.
I love that analogy. I love that analogy of Lewis Hamilton, because don't forget, he's also got the might of you know, a Mercedes team behind him. You know, there's a 200 plus staff that is supporting the delivery of that. Let's not to take away the fact that he's an amazing sportsman, right? You know, and an athlete. In order for him to achieve at that level, he's got a lot.
He needs the team behind him, right? It's not just it's a great analogy.
And that goes from the executive to the guy that's, you know, in the pit. Right. You know. And you can use that to focus your organization. That's a great one.
So no, go for it. So but it is that it's the get those things done and focus on that, because and you can tease a lot of that out with your risk assessment as well, right? So that's where we're helping lots of people. Risk gives you that kind of context of your business, the scenarios that you might be impacted by, and you can kind of take some fairly objective analysis of you know, what the events are, what the consequences might be, and therefore what your mitigation strategies should be. And it's also that common language that you can use to communicate between you know, technical and non-technical staff, and that's where I think well, we try and help organizations, but there's a lot that people can do to get that to improve the way they're doing that. So moving away from, you know, your kind of qualitative 5x5 risk assessment. I'm sure we've all seen them. You know, you got 5 things across the bottom and 5 up the side, and the top right hand are all colored red, and there's a band of, you know, amber stuff in the middle, and then some green down the bottom. And magically, by doing these things, it will move it down 1 and across 2, and that's then green. So yeah, we're you know, well done everyone. And those kind of 5, those kind of more traditional methods, which a lot of people still aren't getting right. They can lead people the wrong way. So, you know, you don't want to end up with a single likelihood estimate and a single, you know, impact estimate. It implies precision, and I think often as security practitioners, because there's a lot of unknowns, we try and latch on to specific things to try and you know, because we feel that, especially if it's being reported up to management, that it's got to be you know, it's got to be that precise thing. So you'll see people reporting the exact number of vulnerabilities they've got. Now, your chief exec, your CFO, your, you know, don't care how many vulnerabilities you've got. It's a really bad metric to be presenting to them. You know, equally saying that there is a you know, a 2 high, 2 red and 3 amber and 5 green risks. You know, how are they understanding that? We're trying to hide the uncertainty of cyber risk by being precise and putting labels on. But in doing that, you also make it more difficult to aggregate and kind of communicate it. You know, if you take you've got to put something on there that is the worst case. So if you're Maersk and there's a chance that there's £100 million, you know, ransomware incident again, then all of a sudden that risk is now categorized as being way up there on the spectrum as being £100 million thing. You go and try and add all those up, and people are going to turn around and tell you that's absurd. It's bonkers. You know, it can't possibly be that high. And that's because it isn't, right? But we can help people take a more accurate rather than precise view and say, well, we think it's between this range of 10 to 20, rather than, you know, 19.5433 you know, and apply some of that expert judgment. You know, when you try and put a risk on a 5x5 and you put it into those categories, you're you're probably making some sound judgment calls on how frequently you think it's going to happen and what you think the impact is going to be to the business, hopefully in conjunction with them. But then you're throwing it all away by saying it's, in this really big bucket. And
so I think qualitative measurements work to provide you with at least a boundary of where you think your level of risk exposure is, right? And it's never going to be accurate because it's qualitative, right? You're never going to be able to say with that kind of level of precision you're talking about that, the risk may materialize in a particular way, shape, or form. I think part of what, and to the point where you made about, reporting vulnerabilities, I don't necessarily believe you need to report all vulnerabilities. Actually, in showing where you have vulnerability can also lead to process improvement. So if you're consistently, and so taking away from security, if you're consistently reporting around, thousands of vulnerabilities, you've got a people problem. You've got a technology problem. You don't necessarily have a cybersecurity problem, right? You may have a configuration. So there are different ways you can slice that, right? I think.
And I agree entirely, and I think that's one of the areas where we focused, and we're actually running a few trials with a few customers at the moment on a new risk service that we're launching shortly, and it's more centered around that kind of continuity. So, to help people quantify, but also thinking of it in almost like in terms of risks and issues, if you think of it in that way, and kind of project management. You've got risks and you've got incidents, and an incident is when that risk scenario has manifested as a kind of a concrete thing. And so you're probably sat on a lot more data than you think. So, yes, going back to the Maersk example, maybe there is a 0.01% chance that you're going to lose 100 million to ransomware this year. Equally, in an organization that size, I would hazard a guess that they probably were getting multiple ransomware outbreaks every month, right? But the controls were doing what they should do. Someone clicked on a link that they weren't meant to, because we're all human, and it's pretty easy to generate a good-looking, kind of phishing email. But someone clicked the link, got infected with malware, but the AV did what it should do, locked it down to that machine, but you still incurred losses from productivity. There was IT and remediation costs, there was security investigation, So, I don't know, for argument's sake, let's say that there were, that was 10 grand a month it was costing them. I can't remember whether they're 20,000 or 40,000 employees. Maybe it's a lot more, but that kind of order of magnitude, right? So yes, there's that 0.1%, not 0.01% chance of 100 million. But you know what? If you look back through their incident log, at the end of it, you'd say, there is a 100% chance that we're going to lose 120 grand this year to ransomware or malware or whatever your scenario might be. Because we can see these risks have become incidents. And so now let's focus on how do we reduce the, to your point, how do we reduce the cost of responding and remediating to that, or reduce the losses associated with it if you're actually losing money out of the business? How can we make it happen less frequently? And if you can work out a way, maybe it is through automation in some of your response effort, or maybe it's by changing the way that you investigate, or IT deal with rebuilding machines or something like that. If you can cut that those losses by half, if you can do some other kind of awareness campaign, or you can put some other control to catch in the moment those things and halve the frequency that it happens with, well, then you've gone from having a 120k issue to a 30k issue, and you've given basically 100k back to the business in operational efficiency. And that's the kind of thing that's really going to take your security team from being seen as just a cost, and those kind of folks maybe a bit like the IT crowd down in the basement or something like that. Kind of, you've really upped your game at that point, and you're talking a language that the business understands.
But actually, that's really good and extremely valuable. But to add to the sort of conclude that thought process, right? Doing an effective post-mortem and accepting everything that went wrong, and then publicly talking about it with your peer group and within the organization. I'm not saying everything because of what we said before about legality. You might not be able to talk about everything, but actually embracing that failure in the event that that risk has become an incident, and highlighting it and dissecting it like you would do as any part of Postmortem or M&M,
Yeah.
I think would be really useful for an organization to conduct.
It comes back to that kind of the cultural point that we were talking about earlier, right? You know, it's having an open culture rather than a blame culture. And do you know, one of the you know, that there's one of the questions, I think it's from Hamad, was saying, you know, how do you educate people to not click on every link and that kind of stuff? Part of that is in education, and you know, people are going to do it. You're never going to stamp it out, and you know. But if you can, the last thing you want is them to not report it, or to pretend it didn't happen, or try and hide that. Especially if it's something serious, you want a culture where people can come forward and say, you know what, I think this is suspicious, or I did something I shouldn't have done. I'm going to put my hand up, and then work with them to, you know, to say, okay, right, fine, you know, and give them some tips, help them understand, you know, would you have spotted it? If you're the security person, you know, was it actually really good? You know, or actually, does your business, you know, regularly send in, you know, you see sometimes they have HR systems, or you do staff surveys and things, and they come from random addresses and that kind of stuff. You know, how does your business work? And it may be that actually, if you're training people to just blindly accept, you know, whatever arrives in their inbox, that, you know, you're going to have higher rates of that. But, you know, you're never going to end up in that situation where, you know, you've managed to stamp that out entirely. And I think having that supportive culture, and like you say, where you learn from each other and the lessons that are going on, that's where you want to be. Perfect.
Well, listen, Robin, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been a really great conversation. You know, anyone that's wanting to get in touch with you can connect with you via LinkedIn and Twitter.
On LinkedIn, you can find me. I'm Robin Oldham. On Twitter, I'm at RTO. If you like the sound of the risk thing, sorry, I'm just going to do a little quick pitch. Like I say, we're doing some proof of concepts at the moment. If you're interested in quantifying your risk, we're doing some pretty good deals at the moment, because we want to. It's quite a good point actually to finish on. We're talking about learning and continual improvement. You know, we want to kick the tires on this new service that we've got. So we want to work with you to deliver you that kind of better way of thinking about your risk, but also we want to learn from you as to how it works and how easy or not it is to implement within your business.
Lost me for a second.
Oh yeah, you're back. I was going, where are you gone?
Sorry.
Yeah, so there'll be some links in the show notes, I think, and you know, or you can drop me a message, and yeah, some good deals to be had at the moment.
Okay, perfect. And just very lastly, you've got a Robin's newsletter. Can you just tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah. So last week was the 100th edition of my newsletter. So coming up on a couple of years now that I've been writing it. Every week it goes out 7 o'clock. It started as a way for me to kind of force myself, if you like, to think about what's happened that week, and try and better explain and track what's going on. You know, what are the trends that we're really seeing in the industry? But also because, as you may have gathered, I'm quite interested in the data behind it and how we can apply a bit of science to things rather than, you know, red, amber, green. So yeah, it's kind of curated news, things that I found interesting, and a whole load of interesting stats every week as well. There's a fair few subscribers now after 100 editions. So yeah, if people want to subscribe to that, it's absolutely free. Hopefully you get something interesting, something useful that you can take back into your kind of day-to-day role and kind of life. And it goes out every Sunday at 7 o'clock. So should be either something for a bit of bedtime reading, or you know, in your inbox first thing on Monday morning.
Well, perfect. Well, listen, thank you so much again for taking the time to speak to you. Really appreciate it.
Pleasure. Thank you.
The rest of the sunshine out today. And to everybody else, thank you so much for joining us today. Join me in a couple of weeks' time where I'll be talking to another special guest about the things that are going on in the world. Cheers and bye-bye.